Madam Speaker, Team Ireland is here to stand for true representation. We believe there are times when people are unified under a culture and an identity that is so definitively separate from their nation that we want to give them a voice. And as the Republic of Ireland, we are truly proud to stand in proposition of the right to regional independence. And we've done this, first of all, in Paul's speech under the 2.0. He talked about firstly how that arbitrary lines don't define a nation. He then went on in his second point of substantive to discuss how there's a necessity for full national autonomy. And finally, what I'm going to deal with in my speech, which is the idea of how this motion solves conflict that comes within internal nations that don't allow secession. But before I do, I want to look at the main areas of case brought to us by the first speaker from Team Singapore. Now, I want to look at his points, and I also want to look at his challenge on our model, because, basically his problem with our model was, they just kind of threw up ideas, first of all, they assumed that all big states are just going to try and stop any nation from seceding. We think that first of all, is assuming that every country is some kind of autocratic regime that wants to, destroy and not allow that. We think that is no thank you. It is not something that a rational nation will recognize. We think that they do see that in these states, if these people want independence, and they have a reason to want to be separate, and they have grounds for that. We don't think it's always going to be that nations will try and suppress and kill and fight to do that. We think that is something that the opposition have kind of confined this debate into. We don't think it's as simple as that. Also, he kind of tried to throw up, stumbling blocks for us, like they'll just disperse their people about. We don't think it's that easy, because we think that you look to countries like Scotland, you look to these regions like Tibet, where these people group because they live together. We think that a nation would respect those differences, and then it's not just about someone who's acting irrationally. I think we have to respect what this means, symbolically as well. So then we have this first point about minimizing conflict. Because, we got it in the POI, first of all, this idea that China will invade Tibet. And, what are you going to do about it then? Sure, it can't be a real state if it can be invaded. Ladies and gentlemen, the point of this is that we don't allow other countries to invade any country they wish. That's why we have an international community, and I'll take you in one moment. That we think that these countries, like the international community, will defend them. Because you mentioned China, there's another big country called the USA, who doesn't tend to get on very well with them. And they tend to stop these things from happening.
How are you going to stop China from invading Tibet when the US is dependent on China for its debt and China has a veto on
Yes, sir. Also, China is also very sensitive to do things like, we have, if you want an example of where there's a deadlock there, things like North Korea and South Korea, that both countries have a stance and have a size. China is backing away from backing North Korea. And we would say that that's a sign that they don't thank you, that they don't have that power. We also say that it is worth the time. Because we say, even if we have to fight for a nation, even if there will be fighting, we think legitimizing a state like Tibet that has been oppressed, for far too long. We think it is important that we preserve the integrity of these people and give them that freedom, and we are willing to fight for them. Also, we have kind of from the opposition this idea that if a country can't defend itself from invasion, it is not a nation. Ladies and gentlemen, I think the majority of the nations in the world are now no longer a country, that we are left with the US of A. Because basically, this idea that if you can't repel invasion and protect your people, you aren't a country, is not true. There is this idea of an international community, and we do look out for each other. And we also see this idea that the answer they gave was they're kind of arguing that we can have devolution for the regional development. And Paul talked about how this doesn't give external legitimacy. You can't be recognized as a nation on an international level, and we think in a principled stance, people don't feel as they're respected in that sense. And then in his point about being economically unviable, he completely ignored what we brought up as a model in this debate. That this debate is about countries or regions that are able to look after themselves. We don't think it's viable, no thank you, for a country to just decide that I want to make my backyard a new nation. And we don't think that that's what this debate is about. We think it's about where this is legitimate and where there is a proper stance for this. And we think it will come about when these countries feel that they can exist on their own. We think that's particularly important, no thank you. So I want to move on to my main point of substantive. And this is the idea of how this motion solves conflict. Because this was a major issue that the opposition also engaged with us in this debate. Because we feel, we give you an example. On the 9th of July 2011, Sudan was partitioned into Sudan and South Sudan. This was a final end to a long, entrenched conflict. Now this conflict was carried out on a tribal level. It was two sides fighting each other. And it was quite a dichotomy in that sense, no thank you. And we think what we did here, by legitimizing these two countries as separate, is we established their differences. We recognize that they are culturally very different, that their beliefs are very different, and that their view of society and the perspective of where they wanted their society to go was very different. And what they lived by was also very different. And we think this independence allowed an end to physically and I'll take you in a moment, the physical manifestation of violence of these countries, that they could turn to the state that they now have to represent and go their separate ways, South Sudan and Sudan itself. Yes, sir.
If you listen to my first speaker's speech, the next thing North Sudan did was to attack South Sudan, steal some of its most important oil producing systems.
Sir, the point is, what we're talking about here is that overall we have reduced conflict, we have given legitimacy, because again, we say, even if there will be some conflict, we're not adverse to that, because we think the principle of giving people their right to democracy, as you didn't engage with in our first speaker's speech, when he talked about the principle of people being able to say that they have an independence and they need to be respected and have their voice in society, because we don't think that that's given by something like devolution. So the question we have to ask is, why was this physical manifestation of violence allowed to come down to a large extent? Because we do think it is much lessened, and that this fighting has come to largely to more peaceful means. Because we think that this violence that they were committing against the other side was about discontent. And this discontent came from the fact that these two sides felt inferior. They didn't feel represented in the state. We feel that there was a lack of recognition of them as separate entities. And what we think that we've done now is given them an equal footing. These two nations do not need to turn to violence, because they have a government, they have a voice, they have someone who represents them and the views that they have. And we think that staying in your own country is something that people can respect, and we think that, no, thank you, that people will respect it when they have their own nation. Because when in Sudan, and in the country that they feel under, they do not feel like citizens when they're oppressed by a regime they don't feel is representing them. But we believe that what we're doing here is because they have nothing to lose at the stage where they're not actually a part of it. They don't feel a part of it. They don't care about it, because it's not something that they can identify with. Now they have their own identification within their own country. And this changes your perspective for the need to fight. Because what these people were fighting for was legitimacy, was recognition. And now you're a citizen of a state that truly represents you. You have to cross a border to fight. You have to go to the enemy, and we don't think there's even a reason for these people to continue fighting. We feel that to a large extent, these people got their legitimacy and that's what they want. And we feel more than that, this allows reconciliation of differences. Because once we recognize the differences of these people, we allow them to resolve them and to approach each other with respect. Because once they're under the same nation, they don't feel like they have a legitimacy to say, we are what we are and you respect that. But when they're two separate nations, that border that defines them is not about being divisive. It's about a respect, a mutual understanding of the differences between you. And we think those are differences that are never going to go away. And when those exist, we feel the right to independence is something that should always be preserved. And ladies and gentlemen, for those reasons, we beg you to stand in proposition.